Hey, thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm here with Katie Santora, the head winemaker for Chehalem in the Willamette Valley. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Gabe. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. How are you doing out there?
We are hanging in there, especially with the climate that's happening, but in our little wine micro universe, we're doing pretty good actually. We just started blending our 2019 Pinot Noirs, and so that's really exciting and kind of is the first step for us to close out the 2019 vintage and get ready for 2020, and realizing that harvest, even with everything that's going on, is just around the corner and nature just keeps going. So yeah, trying to do all of that as safely and social distance and all that as we can.
I spoke to a winemaker a few weeks back who, talking about the upcoming 20 vintage, said, there's nothing we can do about what's going on around us. All we can do is make the best wine we've ever made. And then in a year or 2 years from now, people can hopefully remember 2020 for some killer wines and not everything else.
I am so hoping that one good thing can happen this year, that we have a smooth, especially in Oregon, a smooth harvest with great weather and, just it's been a really, really cool spring, or I guess probably like more Oregon normal cool spring. So things are a little bit further behind than the last few years, but more consistent with cooler climate Oregon. And I'm just hoping that it stays warm so everything can get ripened and we won't have to, make some sacrifices or figure out how to deal with maybe less than ideal fruit conditions. So that is my hope of a positive twist to 2020.
Great. Yeah, and you don't want to be picking grapes on Christmas Eve.
No,
So,
I
yeah.
definitely don't want to be doing that. I mean, our like wine family now is kind of our bubble. You have your family
Yeah.
bubble, and now our at the winery I have like my wine bubble. And so maybe if there's not a vaccine or a way to go see other family, like maybe Christmas Eve won't be so bad at the winery because we'll just be like with our little wine
Well,
family.
just open whatever you want and keep keep,
Yeah,
keep drinking until everybody passes out.
exactly.
So you've been with Chehalem, I think, about 8 years now.
It has been 8 years. Yep, I started in June of 2012.
So what was your journey that got you? Tell me about your winemaking journey leading up to that, and becoming head winemaker at Chehalem.
Absolutely. So I'm sure everyone has their own, story of how they fell into wine, which mine is no different, basically. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, so not an epicenter for wine or winemaking whatsoever, but my family was not LDS or in the Latter-day Saints Mormons. So wine was a part of our culture at night, where my parents would drink wine with dinner, and it just was a part of our lives. And then when I graduated from high school, I really wanted to leave Salt Lake City and just see what else was out there, and started jumping around to different colleges just to find what I wanted to study. I didn't really believe in just choosing something and then having it like work out, hopefully, in a sense. And so I started at the University of Oregon for my freshman year and didn't really find what I wanted to study. And so I went to Southern California to a community college. And my goal was to get in-state residency there because they have so many schools available that I was like, one school will have what I want to study when I eventually figure it out. So between my, I think, sophomore year and would be my like junior year, but my first and second year at community college, I went back home and was with my family for the summer, and my dad's good friend was in the kitchen, and he was talking to me about, how's school, how parents, friends do, just giving you the third degree a little bit. And I was like, yeah, I don't really know what I want to study, trying to figure it out. I love science, but I don't necessarily want to be a scientist in a laboratory. I love, medicine, but I'm not ready to commit to 12 years of school with like not being completely sure. Anyway, long story short, he had gone to UC Davis and became a nurse. My dad's a doctor. And so that's how they were friends. And he was like, you know what you should study? When I was there, there's this great wine program, and it would be really cool to study wine and go into winemaking. And I was just like, nobody does that. Like, that's not a real thing. But somehow this like little seed that he said, I still remember, and I owe him basically everything, got stuck in my head, and I started researching what it took to become a winemaker and what everything went into it basically. And it was so much science and math that I was like, yes, this might be the career I've thought about, because I love those things and I'm great in it, but just wasn't ready to not be outside and all this different stuff that just didn't resonate with me. And then looking at being able to travel, I was like, all right, let's try this. And worst case scenario, I get a degree with a great science backing and then travel for a little while and figure it out. So I basically applied and did not get in my first time applying, and went back and talked to a counselor, and we made a game plan for how to try and get into it. And basically it was just a class curriculum and getting good grades. And so I worked really hard, and the second year when I applied, I got in. And so I went to UC Davis for my undergrad in enology and viticulture, and then started traveling and just kind of got, just the more and more I got into it, the more kind of the claws got into me. I think I would say a lot of people's story, and what I tell people, once you start learning about wine and going down that rabbit hole, it just goes longer and longer and more interesting and different. And it was just fascinating. I started in the very academic way, but really feel like my winemaking skills grew on the day-to-day and traveling and seeing different and other areas and how they make wine and learning about the wine culture in those areas. So that's how I got in the wine industry, or I got to be very interested in wine. But then to come to Oregon, a girl that I had gone to school with, Wynn Peterson Nedry, she was from Oregon, and her father was one of the founders of Chehalem. And back in 2010, I had a pretty difficult harvest, and it was early in California and late in Oregon. And she had mentioned, hey, you know, you might be able to come up and do a double harvest in a vintage. And I was like, yeah, let's forget this California one and let's go to Oregon and see what it's all about. And I just had one of the best vintages of my career at that point. I was at Rex Hill and A to Z. So just across the street from Chehalem, and just the energy and camaraderie of Oregon and the industry just filled what I was looking for. And so really just dug my heels in and tried to make a home here, and basically have been here since. I've done a couple other vintages since 2010 outside of Oregon, but for the most part, continued to find myself here, and then got the position at Chehalem in 2012 and have been here ever since.
Where what other regions have you made wine in? You mentioned California. Was that in Napa, Sonoma, or where in California were you working?
I worked at St. Francis in Sonoma. That was my first vintage. And then I worked at a custom crush facility called Motion in the Russian River. And then I have done a couple harvests in New Zealand. So one in Martinborough at Martinborough Vineyards, and one in Central Otago at Mount Edward. And then a vintage in Australia in Margaret River, and one in Chile. So it's been great.
Really, a lot of those, Motion, Central Otago, you mentioned a lot of places, Margaret River, where Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir has kind of, in a sense, been all around you through much of your journey, it sounds like.
It has, and I've heard a few people say this, but I really believe that you go into it thinking you're going to make something, and then something else comes along your way. Like Pinot Noir started becoming a thread, and it definitely now is a huge part of my career, and I enjoy it so much. And I think, not to jump back and forth a little bit, but I think also like white wines were interesting to me, but never like, oh, all I want to do is make white wines. And I feel that white wines even more so have like resonated in me without even trying to go down that path. So I think in a weird way, wines almost pick you. And like as much as you want to, I think, go in a direction, if you push it too hard with wine, it ends up not working with the wine itself. So you almost have to be fluid with what opens up to you. That's a little like heady.
Well, yeah, but I mean, some of life is also situational, where you end up and what resources, and in that case, the resources, grapes, vineyards that are available to you, and what does well in those areas. So that plays into it too. Yeah, it's a little, like universe talking to you is kind of what you were saying, but
Totally.
that's part of it too.
Yeah.
And so you started at Chehalem, and now you're head winemaker. You were assistant winemaker for a number of years first.
Yep. So I got hired as assistant winemaker, and then in 2016 became associate winemaker, and then got promoted after the vintage in 2018 to head winemaker.
And is that around the time that Chehalem was acquired by Stoller?
So Chehalem was acquired by Stoller in February of 2018. So I think I had to prove myself a little bit that I could, without Win and Harry around at Chehalem, that I could also run the facility and make the wines in the thread that Chehalem makes them, because I personally find that very important, is to keep the thread of Chehalem through the years. It's such, I feel like, clean, transparent wines, which whether that's always been with my winemaking style or was also influenced by working at Chehalem before that, but I really appreciate just the transparency that the wines that Chehalem has always made. And so that was a major goal of mine going forward, was to really, one, have it start in the vineyard, so clean fruit that comes in, and then just helping the wine along instead of molding it. Just being there as more of like a guide and making sure that its path is healthy and clean. And so when consumers get to drink it, they're, tasting a piece of Oregon that really is where it comes from.
And I guess more specifically your property and the
yes, our properties. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so has much changed since the acquisition by Stoller, whether it's philosophy wise or anything. Is there any big change, or is it just more of the same?
So there have been a few changes. So our flagship tier of wines that are in the national market used to be called Three Vineyard, and it is now called the Chehalem Mountains. We decided to focus, I think, sort of like Stoller's brand is focused on their property in the Dundee Hills. And in that same vein, we wanted to focus on the Chehalem Mountains. So focusing on these different AVAs in the Willamette Valley. And Chehalem at the time had 2 vineyard properties that were already in that Chehalem Mountain AVA. So one was in Ribbon Ridge AVA, which is a sub AVA of Chehalem Mountains, and then one is in Chehalem Mountains proper. Harry and Win in the acquisition got to take with them the first plantings that Harry planted in 1983 from Ribbon Ridge. So with that, a little bit of glut in our production on the Chehalem side, and us focusing on the Chehalem Mountains, we actually outsourced a few different vineyards within the Chehalem Mountains. So that changed a little bit. It gave us a little more diversity, I felt like, and complexity. And also, I mean, personally, for a winemaker, it was really fun to work with different vineyards. I was actually really nervous about it and thought, oh my gosh, I don't really know the vineyards as well. will I be able to do as good of a job? But I feel like it really gave my winemaking a bit more depth and layers as well, and just helped me understand the AVA a bit more in general. Chehalem Mountains is so diverse and so big. It's one of the biggest AVAs in the Willamette Valley. And actually there's been a few petitions to break up some more sub AVAs because there's such different soil types within it. And one just passed called the Laurelwood District AVA, which Corral Creek, our one of our estate wineries, is in. So we're now within 2 sub AVAs. But with all that said, our goal going forward is to, again, be 100% estate owned. So we did buy another piece of property that's in the Chehalem Mountains and is also in this new Laurelwood district, and have been planting it out. And hopefully this fall we might get a little bit of fruit off it. But the goal is to really focus on the Chehalem Mountains AVA, which I love the Chehalem Mountains AVA. So I'm really excited about it, and that works great.
Was it additional Pinot Noir plantings, Chardonnay? What are you guys focusing on in those new plantings?
Definitely some more Chardonnay. We don't, between our Ribbon Ridge vineyard and our vineyard at Corral Creek, we don't have that much Chardonnay right now. And I love Chardonnay, and it's blowing up right now. So I'm really excited that they wanted to plant some more. So definitely some more Chardonnay, definitely Pinot Noir. We're going to plant some Gruner Veltliners so we can keep that in our program. That's usually more on the DTC side of things, smaller, about like 250 cases. I think we're going to try working with some other aromatic whites. I think we're planning Pinot Blanc. I know we're planning some Gamay at Corral Creek, but that's not at the new facility. And yeah, just talking about some different clones of Pinot Noir that maybe can deal with heat if heat starts becoming more and more of an issue, and just experimenting a little bit, which is exciting.
Yeah. So what rough case production are you guys at total for the whole winery?
So we've definitely been we've been consistent with what we have, and even maybe restrained back a little bit. So we're at around 25,000 cases a year.
Okay.
Yep. And I think at this point, and especially with everything that's going on with Corona, we're going to probably stay right around there, or even, get restrained back a little bit more until restaurants and everything are up and running.
Makes sense. So you mentioned transparency and planting more Chardonnay. I think that leads into our first wine.
Yeah, let's try it.
Which is the Inox Unoaked Chardonnay.
Yep.
So tell me, I'm curious. Well, tell me about the wine, but also what I'm curious about is there is so much good Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley. I'll call it, more traditionally, produced Chardonnay, more barrel fermented, which obviously Chehalem also makes. Is there still a big call for unoaked Chardonnay? Because this, it seems like it's a, kind of a specific consumer that likes the unoaked Chardonnay, at least in my perception. Is that accurate, or am I misconstruing?
No, I would absolutely agree with you. I think there's definitely a market for it. Actually, I think more than others. I think there's a lot of preconceived perceptions on Chardonnay of what you're going to get out of a bottle, which is a bit more of that barrel Chardonnay. So a little more roundness, a little creamier, especially like California style. Where I think with the stainless steel Chardonnay, I still find when we were going out and doing tastings, consumer tastings and whatnot, a lot of the time we would have our Chardonnay, our Pinot Gris, and our Pinot Noir. And more often than not, everyone would not want to try the Chardonnay. It always like, no, I'm sorry, I don't like Chardonnay, which was really surprising to me because I have always really liked Chardonnay. But I would always be like, oh, are you sure, you're at this event. If you don't like it, you're not going to offend me. You should at least try it. this isn't like your typical Chardonnay. It's a lot more aromatic and bright, clean, crisp. It has a little bit more of like that acid that really pairs well with food. And then more often than not, they would taste it and they'd go, oh my gosh, this is the best Chardonnay I've ever tasted. And I think it's because it just doesn't have those barrel aspects to it. And they were so set on it being one way. So I love this Chardonnay because I think it's in a way a gateway Chardonnay for everyone that will change their idea about the varietal in general.
Well, what's surprising to me about it, it's more complex and acid driven with greater mouthfeel than I would have anticipated in a stainless steel Chardonnay. Often
Thanks.
stainless steel Chardonnays are kind of one note.
Yeah.
It's just some fruit and some flab and not oaky. Of course, this one's not oaky, but not much going on. But this one actually has quite a bit going on. So how do you achieve that in a stainless steel Chardonnay?
So I think a few different things. One, this does come from a few different vineyards. So the characteristic of each of the vineyards goes into the wine in general. And I do think pick decisions are pretty important when it comes to Chardonnay, especially stainless steel. You want, at least I taste in the vineyard, I taste the fruit where I'm looking for, it has a bit of a sharp acid note, and you can almost taste it falling off. And when it just starts to fall off and more like flavors come through, that's when I like to pick it. And I think that helps keep the acid that you're talking about on the back palate, but also then helps some of those aromatics come out. I also think it's really important to, when you press it, it all goes into one tank, and then we rack it off of kind of the heavier stuff that can be pressed off. And when we rack it into another tank for fermentation, I think it's really important to go into the next tank really clean. So a lot of the time with more, you can go a little bit dirtier and it gives a bit more complexity and I think roundness to the wine when you take more of the heavy stuff that gets pressed off. And this way, I think when you don't, it keeps the fermentation extremely clean. And then I really believe in doing a few different fermentations and then blending them together. So it's not just a one shot. So for the 2019, for example, we had it in 3 different tanks and used 3 different yeast strains. So each of these yeast strains can also give different aromatic complexities that then once blended together, again, just gives some more layers. And also during the fermentation, keeping it really cool. So the fermentation really doesn't get above 60 degrees the whole time. So it's a very, very slow fermentation process, which in my mind keeps all those nuanced aromatics that come from the vineyard, that come from the yeast strain, really kind of enclosed in the wine as possible without losing it.
Yeah, what you've described is an incredibly thoughtful winemaking process for an unoaked Chardonnay. And I think that so many unoaked Chardonnays don't come anywhere near that in terms of thoughtfulness.
Oh, interesting.
I think often the winery wants to have a white wine that for people who don't like oak Chardonnay, don't like red wine, and they don't have, let's say, Sauvignon Blanc, and they make Chardonnay, so like, oh, let's throw together some unoaked. Sort of it's kind of like unintentional rosé in a sense.
Yeah.
I think it's
totally.
a similar ideology but this is really lovely.
Thank you very much. I'm happy. I'm really happy with this one. This one I was worried about, not in like a bad sense, but just it's nice when you do, like I said, when working with other vineyards. And like I said, I was a little bit worried with that idea, and then seeing it come out in the end, it's just really exciting because I feel like I grow as a winemaker, and then being able to see that it comes out in a wine it feels really good.
I bet. Well, congrats.
Thanks.
So how long has that been part of the portfolio?
It's been a part of it for a really long time. I don't know the first vintage of Enox, but it definitely was before I was around. So, and it had been around for years.
Is
So,
the methodology you described pretty similar to what was going on even before your time, or did you convert it sort of into this wine that you described, very thoughtful on oak Chardonnay?
I would say the major thread of it was there, absolutely. I think a main difference, and that threw a little more variability in it, is the Enox in the past was about 98% from Stoller Vineyard. And that now in the 2019 blend, I think it's more like 60%. So not that it's easier on one site, it's definitely different, but when you're balancing a few different vineyards, I think that adds complexity in a different way, and maybe some more takes more energy or more mental energy to just make sure that each of those pieces are where you want them to be. And then I think just like any evolution between any winemaker or winery in general, I think you just always want to get better. So I think just in the nature of the humanness, the continuation of like, all right, I liked this Enox, but what can we do better? How can we make sure that fermentation's cleaner? You know, it's just that continuation of tweaking just slightly to make it just a little more elevated each year. I think that's maybe changed a little bit, but the major thread, I think, has been there.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've got Pinot Gris next. And so tell me about the Pinot Gris, but also tell me alongside of that, I think it's a interesting thread. You've been in, like you said, and we've said, in Willamette Valley for a decade. And I feel like Pinot Gris has changed a bit. It doesn't seem to have quite the prominence it did in Willamette Valley a dozen years ago. How have you seen it shift, and what do you think of that, and what do you think of your Pinot Gris and all that?
I guess in 10 years, it maybe has shifted a little because I think Chardonnay from Oregon is getting a lot of credit and a lot of hype. And sometimes I feel like white wine versus white wine, it's not like unless you really know wines, you know, it's not Chardonnay, Pinot Gris. It's like, it's a white wine. Which one do you like better? And so maybe there's a little competition between each other in that sense. But I mean, Pinot Gris put Oregon on the map. You know, Pinot Gris was planted in 1964, I think the year was, by David Lett. So the Pinot Gris varietal, I feel like, is one of just the major roots that got Oregon even really known for Pinot Gris. So Pinot Gris has always done really well in Oregon. And I think with a cool climate back in the day, just the grape itself can handle that with, you know, it's a pretty difficult grape to work with. Anyone that doesn't know what Pinot Gris looks like on the vines. The grape itself is actually gray looking. So that's why it's called Pinot Gris. Gris is gray. And if you're not careful with how you handle the Pinot Gris when it comes in, you really can get some phenolics that come through on the skins. So it's a pretty versatile grape in general that can go in a lot of different directions. And I think being cool climate, it probably just was able to handle the cold really well, you know. Yeah, and the Pinot Gris clones that were here just did fantastic. So there was never a little bit of a glut of like, what is this varietal? Where with Chardonnay, it really struggled in the beginning in Oregon. And then I think recently, I mean, it's gotten very, a lot of excitement behind it recently in the last, I would say, maybe 10 years, and is just like continuing. But I think that's because we figured out what clones to plant with cooler climates back in the 90s. And so now we were able to learn how to make Chardonnay in Oregon, where before that, Pinot Gris had like a leg up, you know, like 30 years before that.
So yeah, so clearly Pinot Noir is the king. And for a long time, I guess Pinot Gris was right behind it. Has Chardonnay surpassed? Will it surpass it? Where do you see that falling out? Just in terms of
Um,
planting and popularity and all that.
I think Chardonnay is getting more popular, but definitely planting wise, it's way behind Pinot Gris. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head. I can send them to you. We just got our Oregon report, but Pinot Gris is planted much more prevalently in the valley than Chardonnay is. I just feel like Pinot Gris is just a staple that people really trust and can go to. I think our Pinot Gris in general, it's made with the same intention as the Chardonnay in the sense that we really want to keep the acid retention with it. We want to have some complexity on the palate, but really just want a clean wine that goes really well with foods. And I think these two wines against each other really show that even with very similar technical winemaking methodology behind it, the aromatics between them are just extremely different. Where in the Pinot Gris, I get a lot more stone fruit. It just seems a little more, it has a little more weight just naturally in the aromatics than the Chardonnay does. So that's also a fun comparison to just, see as your own consumer what preference you like.
It is. It also just, it's really a good, side by side, they're a great example of just really tasting the grape. Because they're really, sort of uncovered versions of those grapes. And yeah, they both have that great acidity. Obviously, the fruit is different. The Pinot Gris is a bit brighter fruit in the mouth, and it gives that perception of sweetness.
Yep.
As the Chardonnay has got more of sort of like a little bit of the tart fruits going on.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, somebody who likes one of them stylistically, from a mental perspective, they should like both of them. They may not if they taste them, but if you look at them, they really, somebody who likes one should like the other, quite frankly.
Yeah, I would agree.
So how big is Pinot Gris for you guys specifically?
So I think this year we produced, so 2019, we produced 2,300 or 2,300 cases or 2,600 cases, right around there.
So close to 10% of your production.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Enox, Pinot Gris, and the Pinot Noir, the Chehalem Mountains Pinot Noir make up probably, I would say 85% of what we make. So it is pretty important to be very thoughtful in these processes that I think some places might be able to skip over that just because, we get to work with some really fun varietals that are a lot smaller that go through the tasting room. But what my, ultimate goal is getting these wines out there to anyone and everyone to taste that then get excited for Chehalem and go, wow, what else are they doing? And then if they want to nerd out or try different things, either go to the website and see what we're doing in the tasting room or come to the tasting room and taste some of the stuff that really doesn't get out to the national market.
It makes total sense. There must be a lot more pressure to make a wine like the Pinot Gris than there is a small production 200 case thing that's in your tasting room and wine club. I would think, because it's I like to look at it where they're all really important, because once you really start tiering up things, then you get that excuse to not give things or ferments or lots as much attention that maybe you should give. So I really like to look at it like, all right, these are like all the things we really, really have to take care of, and just over the nature of fermentations and time, other things stand out than other ones, probably because of the small interactions that are happening in wines that we can't explain yet.
And then, yeah, you go from there. But I really look at everything as being like extremely, extremely important because, yeah, I don't know. Before me and you talked, like, I didn't know what your go-to would be. So what if I have one chance to make you excited? I got to do like everything I can to make that one bottle like the best one bottle I can do.
So we've got the rosé of Pinot Noir.
Awesome.
And it's just a beautiful hue on this wine. So my first question about the rosé is, you talked about, you know, the wine finds you, and you might think you're going to make this, you end up making that. And so before going to Chehalem, had you had much rosé making experience? And certainly,
Not,
like in the
not a
last,
lot, to be honest. I feel like you're the first person that asked me that, but I've always loved rosé. Like, as maybe cheesy as it is, I am a rosé all day proponent for sure.
I every bottle of rosé that comes into my house and goes in my refrigerator that I taste, just none of it goes down the sink. Lots of other stuff.
There's always an excuse to have a glass of rosé. You're like, well, I'm mowing my lawn.
Yeah,
Might as well do it with a glass of rosé.
in your in the last number of years, we've also are becoming more a rosé drinking country where we were not a rosé drinking country. So
Yeah.
that's kind of dovetail too. That's part of the reason for my question. If you hadn't made a lot and then you started making it, how it's a kind of is it a different experience, or is it just like making any other wine?
So I think with this Chehalem Rosé, it's been a really interesting journey. So I think they did make it a couple of years before 2012, but it really didn't become a staple until I think we started really wanting to trial and error it in 2014. I want to say maybe 13, 14. And I don't remember exactly the year because in the beginning it was a trial and error of like, what kind of rosé do you want to make? And I think that's what's really interesting about rosés in general. There's so many different styles you can do where you can grow it in the vineyard, which we do. We start in the vineyard. Basically, our viticulturist at the time said one of our vineyards, the Corral Creek vineyard that I mentioned where the winery is at, it's probably our as a Pinot Noir, our lightest Pinot Noir. So I would say like our most elegant, really floral notes, great acid, not super weighty. So I'd say our lightest Pinot. And he thought that in one of the sections that it produced so much that we could do a double cordon training. So a Scott Henry or double curtain. And so basically we're making 2 fruit zones, and he thought that the vines could handle it enough that it would actually be really, really nice with a Pinot Noir for rosé. So we started experimenting with that. And to jump forward, that's what we do now, and we really, really like it. But to go back in 13 and 14, we experimented with a Saunier rosé, which from some of our vineyards just ended up being really big, a little bit heartier of a rosé, which I think for my preference wasn't exactly what I was hoping to go for. And just as we're mixing with that, we tried a little more like, what would we do if it was in a barrel 100% of the time? What would happen if we put it, in just different vessels? And through like a few years of trial and error, I think we found that what we really liked is the growing it in the vineyard, making it extremely intentional. So when it comes in, those grapes get pressed right away. So they come in from the vineyard, they get pressed right away. So they lose a lot of their color because we're not letting the skin sit on it at all. On a couple of the picks, to get some color, we actually put it in the press, stomp on it at the very end of the night, put CO2 all over it to protect it, close the doors, turn it on its side, and leave it overnight. So it can then get a bit of the natural color, and then press it the next morning. So out of, 100% of the pressings, maybe like 10 to 15% get that extended skin time, which gives it this like extremely light salmon color, which I like in my rosés.
Me too. This is the color of rosé.
Yeah, it just is like refreshing and so pretty. Yeah, so I think 1819 really kicked up the rosé game at Chehalem, where we made 1,000 cases. So that's the biggest amount that we've made here. And I would say that this is probably more of like a baby to me than a lot of the lots that were already here before. So I take a lot of pride and excitement with this wine, especially when people get really excited to taste it, because I love rosé.
So yeah, a wine that didn't really exist before your time there. So let me ask you a question. With Pinot Noir, when people want to geek out about Pinot Noir, one of the things they start talking about, and you mentioned it briefly, is clones. So is that a consideration with when you're making intentional rosé of Pinot Noir? Are there clones that are better for rosé than others?
My gut reaction is yeah. This is made from Pomard in Wadensville. So the Crow Creek Vineyard was planted in 1983 by a couple of doctors, and they weren't really in the vineyard game. And so they kind of got what they could do. The vineyard's beautiful, but it's very artistic rose. Now conventional farming, it makes it a little more difficult, but I think it's really pretty. But they did Pomard and Wadensville, they planted it together. So it's kind of a field blend. Obviously we pick this much different than a still Pinot Noir. So the sugar is a lot lower when we pick this versus our still Pinot Noir. So I think, depending on where you pick that and where you're growing, the clone can matter. But I also think if you are in a really hot place and you have a heavier clone like 667 that can be a bit more dense, I think if you were farming it in a warmer spot and picking it early, I think you still could get really pretty aspects to it. So yes, I think clone, if you got to choose in this spot, I am growing rosé and I am doing this, definitely clones are better than others. But if you are like, I want to make rosé from this vineyard, I think there are picking techniques you can do and farming techniques to still get really beautiful, light aromatics and palate presence, if that's the style you're going for. There are some rosés that are pretty big too.
Yeah, this is a really lovely rosé.
Thanks.
What I like about it is everything is really harmonious. It's got a lovely nose, and the palate is just really even keeled, no sharp edges. It's got a nice finish with good acid, but I've got a bit of stone fruit on the back, a little like white peach, and a little bit of watermelon. It's just really delicious. And after we get off of this call, I'm probably going to drink the rest of it.
Well, this one was fun. So the 2019 vintage was definitely a cooler vintage for us. And so the sugars were a bit lower. So you'll notice like the alcohol is lower as well. But because of that, especially with the rosé, it was a bit lighter on the palate than what we wanted 100%. So after harvest ended, we actually got a concrete tank last year. And so we put about 30% of this blend in the concrete tank and aged it in that for 6 weeks or so. And I feel like if on like the back palate, there's a little texture, almost like a mineralistic wet stone. And I think that really helped kind of flesh out the palate a little bit more than what it was before. So that's kind of a fun fact of this wine and what we did with it.
That is cool. So speaking of concrete, have you used eggs at all?
We do. We have one egg, and we have been using it with our Gruner Veltliner.
Okay.
So in that blend, we do a third egg, a third stainless steel, and a third neutral barrel to help, again, give those layers on the palate. Depending on the year, I'm learning that we need to do a little more stainless steel. The egg is really round, and especially with the neutral oak together, it makes it a bit softer, where, you know, Gruner Veltliner is just so nice when it has that like zing to it. So still working out that balance, but I really, really love, I'm a fan of concrete for sure.
I am as well, and Gruner makes total sense to me when you said that, because a lot of the wines I've had out of egg are Sauvignon Blanc, and
Oh,
I think Gruner and Sauvignon Blanc certainly have some things in common stylistically, and you know, both high acid wines. So that sounds really, you know, logical to me as you said it.
yeah, it's really fun. I like playing with different vessels. So the other concrete tank where we aged this Pinot, or the rosé, and we got for Pinot Noir. So last year was the first year that we fermented still Pinot Noir in a concrete tank, and it was so interesting. I'm like a major, I want to get a couple more because I thought it was fascinating, and just in a blend in general, it's just another layer that gives, you know, that lot of fermentation just some depth to it.
Well, another, as they say, another tool in your toolbox, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So now you've got quite a few, and you'll have to tell me how many Pinot Noirs. Chehalem Mountain. So this
Yep,
is, I take it, your most widely distributed Pinot Noir?
correct. This is our most distributed Pinot Noir. And then, like you said, we have a few other Pinot Noirs. So we make from our 3 estate vineyards, we make a single vineyard Pinot Noir. And then we have a reserve Pinot Noir, which is for us, I mean, obviously reserve means different things to different wineries, and there's not a one terminology that is a reserve, but for us it's our best barrels of the year, and usually a bit bigger of a Pinot. And then we have our statement Pinot Noir every year, which comes from one fermentation, usually one clone, one vineyard, almost 100% new oak. It's just a really, in my eyes, a very interesting snapshot of a vintage. But then not only that, like for all the wine nerds out there, you know, they can really taste what Ridgecrest Clone 777 is in 2017. So just like the nerdy of the Pinot Noirs.
The nerd wine. So, you know, being a bit of a wine nerd, I have to ask the question then, have you ever made a wine, the statement you called it, you said it's called, and then it sort of just revealed itself, and then it's had to be, you know, it's just so good year after year that you have to make that same block or clone or whatever that designation is. You have to repeat making it, or is it really a year to year thing?
It really is a year to year thing. I mean, it's usually a bigger wine, and so because of that, it usually comes from our Ridgecrest vineyard more likely than not, just because the weight's there to help it age for a very long time. It's our most expensive Pinot, so we need it to be able to, you know, in 15 years still really be holding on. And some of those bigger tannins really help Pinot Noirs go the distance.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that a lot of the time that density comes from that vineyard, but it's definitely different blocks. So it hasn't been consistent in the sense of exactly where it is in that vineyard. But the vineyard as a whole, I think, really steps up and showcases itself well for that blend.
Cool. So with the wine that we're drinking, what is this, a cuvee of all the vineyards you farm? What how do you achieve this blend on a yearly basis?
So this blend, what I think Chehalem is also really good about is that it is a vintage dependent winery, where, you know, this blend next to the 2017 and next to the 2019 will taste different. So how we farm and how we make it is really to showcase the best snapshot of the vintage, but also to be approachable earlier on than some of our single vineyards. So when we get this wine, it comes in, I think the biggest difference, because like I said, I treat all of our ferments basically the same. And maybe what is the most different is that it's a composite of all our vineyards. But what I find extremely, extremely important when it comes to Pinot Noir, one of the biggest aspects that help guide a wine to what it's going to be is during the extended maceration phase. So after fermentation is finished or close to finish, we start tasting the tanks every day and really deciding, I mean, we're tasting every day anyway, but really deciding what kind of cap management to do on that wine to either boost up the tannin profile, to soften it, to elongate it. There's some techniques that we can choose to help really make that tannin profile there before it goes into barrel. And I think the biggest difference would be that we treat every tank like that. So all the different vineyards, you really choose different aspects and where to go with it. And then it's all blended together into this wine. So I think it helps give complexity on the back palate, but also when it goes to barrel, the amount of new oak is a lot less. So this is about 10-12% new oak. So our goal making this wine is really to be fruit forward, to show the complexity of the Chehalem Mountains. You know, it's this dense red blue fruit kind of battle aromatically, and then just the structure of all the tannins in the different vineyards together.
It really is exactly what you just said. It's got that dark fruit. It's got depth. You feel a tannin, but it's not overwhelming. But then, the last thing you get is that acid, and this is your sort of entry level, and I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but it's your entry level Pinot Noir, and certainly it's got at least a decade to go.
For sure.
Likely more.
Yeah.
But it's big, but it's very, very well balanced. It's not huge by any means. It's just bigger than maybe a typical Pinot Noir.
Absolutely.
But
And like I said, vintage dependent, 2018 was a pretty warm vintage for us. And
yeah,
not only that, but it was when once vintage happened, the days stayed around 70, 75 and cooled off at nights. And that really was for the duration of the vintage.
yeah.
And so it kind of was one of those vintages where you could like not stress out your cellar by bringing everything in. You were able to be like, all right, okay, the weather's still going good. We're just like slowly getting there. And it's just picking it here, picking it there. And it was a really nice flow to the vintage.
And as it's opening up, it's got this really nice mineral component that's coming out on the back too. And the spices, really, really lovely Pinot Noir.
Thank you very much.
So all the wines that we've tasted and one more, they're all in screw cap, but I know some of your stuff's in cork. So how's that choice made? What should be in screw top and what should be in cork?
Yeah, so that was probably one of the main change that happened during the acquisition. So before the acquisition happened, everything was in screw cap, our single vineyards, our reserve. And then after the fact, we just found that a couple things. One, it's harder for people to spend a lot of money on screw capped wine. So our reserve.
Indeed.
I mean, it's like the truth, it's
No,
something
it is.
that I love screw cap wine. We have trialed it for years and years, and I really stand behind the quality behind it. What goes into the bottle is what we wanted to go into the bottle. It is consistent. It ages amazingly, cork ages great, but trials next to it, I just think the vibrancy of a wine sticks in the wine with screw cap a little bit longer. But the second part of that is that innovation happens, and it's been happening for years. So the cork that we or I or our team were finally okay with going to is actually DM cork.
Mhm,
So
sure.
Diem has years of experience and stand by the fact that their cork is not going to have cork taint. And so because of really thinking about those two and just, we also did a new branding with all of our bottles, it seemed like a good time to bottle our reserve and single vineyard wines in Diem cork. So the thing that I found that's interesting is that you can get different tightness of the Diem cork. So because screw caps are obviously really tight, when we went to it, I went to the tightest cork closure of the Diem. So in 2018, I believe, no, it was the Pinot Noirs of the 2017 that got the first cork Diems from us. And I went to the tightest Diem and am finding that it's actually a little bit tighter than screw cap. So those wines in bottle are taking a little bit longer to open up. Mm-hmm. So in the 2018 vintage, we actually loosened that oxygen exchange just a little bit. So the wines aren't closed, for 3 to 4 years in bottle. It's like 2 to 3 years. It's not quite as intense. So it's definitely a learning curve, but I think they're aging beautifully in Diems as well.
So you find that the Diem is closer to the screw cap than it is to traditional cork?
I would say depending on what type of tightness you get, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
And it's clean. Like I said earlier, it's really important. Not everyone gets to talk to winemakers or any of the people that make the wine. So if we have one chance to have someone taste our wine and it's flawed besides something that we did because of a closure we chose or something like that, and they don't get to ask, like, is this the wine or is this something else? Like that's a loss for us. So I find it really important that what we put in bottle is what the consumer is tasting.
Absolutely. And a lot of consumers don't have the confidence yet to realize, or maybe they never will because they like wine, but they're not, deep dive into it. And they just think, oh, I don't like this wine. Exactly. This is the wine. I don't like it. They have no idea that it's, whether it's corked or whatever's wrong with it. So
absolutely. I do that.
Super important. Yeah.
Different varietals that I don't know very much about, when I taste, I'm like, is this the varietal or is this something else that happened that I don't know about? So, I mean, I don't know. I want to give all the consumers all the confidence to say, like, something's going on and not to be worried about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Whatever you can do to give them that confidence to assure that they have a good experience, you're not doing anything to lessen the product by doing that. So I love screw caps too, by the way.
Yeah, and they're easy when you're like camping or.
Yeah, I mean, look, what you said though is true. If it's a super expensive bottle of wine, I kind of like that long cork on it.
Yeah. Totally.
But then if you open that bottle after you held on to it for a while and it's corked or there's something wrong with it, it's such a buzzkill.
It's such a bummer. It is such a buzzkill. Oh my gosh. You're like, why?
Why? I was holding on to this bottle for 17 years for this day and now it's bad. So we've got one more wine.
All right.
And it's the Gamay Noir.
Yep.
And this is, I should point out, the old label.
Correct.
You guys have refresh isn't the right word. You guys have completely changed the label.
Yep.
This old label is very cool. The new label I would describe as classic. It's just more of a classic thing. So Gamay, I know you guys aren't the only ones, but I'm not asking for like an acre count by any means, but how much Gamay is there in Willamette Valley? I mean, a handful of wineries?
Yeah, I mean, it's increasing, definitely. I don't know the exact acre amount, but I think it would be very easy to put all the Gamay producers in one tasting. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to do next. We'll do a Zoom with all the Gamay in Willamette Valley.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
That'd be fun.
I would love that.
So for anybody watching who doesn't know, Gamay is the red grape that's used to make Beaujolais, which is at the southern end of Burgundy. So it would be natural that another great Pinot Noir producing region, Willamette Valley, would also grow Gamay.
Yes.
This is a 2016, so it's got a couple years on it.
It does have a couple years, but this was a wine that we wanted to show ageability in a screw cap. And tasting it, it's still really bright and young. Something to mention, you said Beaujolais style, but we do our Gamay in more like a Grand Cru style. So it's definitely treated like our Pinot Noirs. So it ferments on skins. We give it cap management where, because Gamay has a bit more acid to it, the acid tannin ratio on the palate can be pretty disjointed, or it can become pretty disjointed because they, instead of complementing each other, almost make each other like bigger. And so with our Gamay, a lot of the time we'll do pump overs only on it to soften those tannins, to make them integrated with the acid, because acid in Gamay is one of, the prominent features, I would say.
It's incredible how much fresh fruit is still on this wine.
Yeah. I love the 2016. I think I was actually surprised that Michelle sent it. I think we're sold out of this. So, but it's a great example of just.
I asked.
Oh, you did? Are we sold out?
No, I don't know. I asked that.
Good choice, because I haven't tasted this wine for a while, and
I was curious,
Yeah, absolutely. But it's our Gamay, this is one of the examples that it's a very small production. We make 100 cases a year. Mm-hmm. So it does sell out pretty quickly, but this is reminiscent of our Gamays every year, where it has density but a lot of brightness to it, especially aromatically. There's like that thread of pepper that Gamay Noir can have, while having some really bright red fruit to it. This one's really dense. Other years aren't quite as dense.
It is. It's I think usually of Gamay with a lot of cranberry, and it's a bit darker than that. Really, really nice. So do you see 100 cases, whether you guys or in general, how do you see Gamay growing in a significant way, or just in sort of a niche way?
I would say probably a niche way, but I can see it getting a lot more momentum. We are planting a bit more, I think, at our new property, like I had mentioned, but also more at Corral Creek, because our 100 cases, it sells out every year, and it's fun to make. The back cellar when we're in harvest is 98% full of Pinot Noir. When you have one tank that is a different varietal, it does get, interns and everyone else just a little more excited, like, ooh, something else is coming in, and
something different.
Yeah. And so it does get a little like special attention because it's different. And I would definitely love to have a little bit more room to experiment with different things with Gamay. And I hope that we increase it a little bit, because I would like to have some fun with it.
Cool. So what do you think, whether it's Gamay or something else, whatever your answer is, what do you think, what's next? What's upcoming both for Chehalem, and in your view from where you sit, what do you see moving forward for Willamette Valley? What's like the next big thing for both?
Well,
and it could be two different answers, by the way.
Yeah. I think so. For Chehalem, we obviously are very known for our Pinot Noirs, but I would say also for our aromatic whites. So really keeping that thread going, and with losing some of the land and getting purchasing land or fruit from other vineyards, we've also had the opportunity to work with different varietals, and that's been really, really fun. But it's been the aromatic white world. So last year we made a Chenin Blanc. This year we did a Sauvignon Blanc. And I think we'll continue that, of just doing these really fun different one-offs. With reds, we got to make a Trousseau Noir. We made a Mongoose Pet Nat, which either people love or hate. But I think keeping just that fun flair of these side projects in our tasting room side is really fun. So with that said, we are getting into the sparkling wine program. We made our first sparkling wine last year, and it'll come out 5 years from now or whatever. But in 5 years, we'll now have a Chehalem sparkling wine, which will be fun. So I think just playing around.
Will it be a vintage sparkling wine?
Yep.
That's cool. Maybe by 5 years from now, COVID will be over. I'll be able to visit and taste it at the winery.
I would love that. Let's make that a plan no matter what, is that you come and visit.
Absolutely.
I think with the Willamette Valley, you had said that you wanted to talk about it. So I was really thinking about if I thought there was one direction that it was going in. And I feel like there's a couple, but both stemmed back from the fact that Willamette Valley is on fire right now. Oregon wines in general, I think people are realizing that Oregon makes great wine, and it's been around now for a while that people are actually seeing it and going, oh, this is great. With everyone else that's really struggling, Oregon is continuing year over year to sell more and more wine because I think people are getting excited about it. So I see two things happening with that. One, more and more people are coming into the valley, which, I am one of those people that came 10 years ago, but without it being where it was at, I wouldn't have stayed. So more and more people are coming into the valley. And with that comes more acquisitions. So even big companies coming into the valley from France, California. Even within the valley, Bill Stoller acquired Chehalem. So I see more and more of that happening, but I also see on the flip side, a lot more smaller producers trying to, produce a label and just make a very small amount of wine. I think because Oregon still is a little bit of that Wild West, anything really goes. And we're in a space right now where the small producer that makes an awesome label can definitely get by and sell, and then people are acquiring property and then they're succeeding. So there's almost this dichotomy of what's happening in the Willamette Valley, but all stems back from the Willamette Valley being awesome.
So what you're saying is interesting. You're saying that there's a lot of movement at the top end size wise and dollars wise, and at the bottom end, the larger wineries or wineries being acquired by larger wineries, and then a lot of also plenty still of garage sort of style winemakers bootstrapping it, and if they do something impressive, maybe then getting some money behind them or just selling enough wine to get to the next level. That's cool.
Absolutely.
That makes it an exciting place.
It is exciting.
I agree. And I'm really, the Chardonnay, and we tasted your unoak, and you guys make some other Chardonnays. There's so much good Chardonnay in Willamette Valley, and I think that alone is really exciting. It's, it's a lot of it's, made in, it's got oak treatment, and it's, but the alcohol is low, and it's not over oaked. They're really like balanced. Really, they're great. Everybody says this kind of thing, but I think they're like very sort of Chablis style.
I would agree. Oregon is definitely finding its niche for Chardonnay, but I feel like it's between Chablis with that energy and acid feel on the palate, while also having a little bit more weight. That's kind of like California. It's like right in this balance of like a little more, less mineralistic and fruitiness of Chablis, and just like balance right between them, I would say.
Yeah, so you've got all that. You've got the New World fruit and New World, but you've also, you've got a cooler climate than California. Yep. So that probably, is part of that equation there.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm excited to see where it all goes. Well, Katie, thank you so much.
Of course.
I look forward to getting back out there
I
and
know.
clinking these in person. But for now,
Cheers.
yeah.